In the monastery nestled within the snowy mountains, where silence was once as thick as the morning mist embracing the ancient wooden pavilions, lived a young monk who carried with him a peculiar fear. It was not the fear of shadows dancing on the walls during nightly ceremonies, nor the reverent fear that some felt before the sacred texts. His fear was of silence itself, of the emptiness that seemed to swallow him whenever he found himself alone. The young monk had arrived at the monastery 3 years prior, bringing with him only the novice robes and a restless heart that beat like an unsteady drum. From the very first days, his Dharma brothers noticed his unusual aversion to solitude. While other novices found peace in moments of seclusion, he drifted through the monastery like a leaf caught in the wind, always searching for some activity, some conversation, anything that would fill the emptiness of silence. In the early hours of the morning, when most monks were still resting in their individual meditations, the young monk could already be found in the monastery kitchen. His nimble hands chopped vegetables for the communal breakfast, even when it wasn't his turn to help. The old cook, Master Tenzo, often watched him with a mix of compassion and concern, noting how his hurried movements and constant chatter masked a deep inner restlessness. "Why do you always come to the kitchen so early, young brother?" Master Tenzo asked one day, watching him slice carrots with nervous precision. "To be useful, Master Tenzo," the young monk replied, without taking his eyes off the cutting board. "It's not good for hands to be idle." "And what about the mind? Should it not also find its own rhythm in the silence of the morning?" The young monk only smiled nervously and continued his work, but his hands trembled slightly as he sliced the next carrot. During the daily meditation practices in the main hall, the young monk was like a candle flickering in the wind. While his brothers remained in serene contemplation, his restless eyes wandered around the hall, counting and recounting the ancient ceiling beams, studying the patterns of shadows on the wooden floor, anything to avoid diving into the ocean of silence surrounding him. In the sutra study sessions, he was known for asking endless questions, some relevant, others merely to keep the discussion alive. Younger teachers appreciated his apparent enthusiasm, but the older masters saw through his mask of intellectual curiosity. To them, each question was like a small cry for help, a desperate plea not to be left alone with his thoughts. One particularly restless day began like any other. The young monk had risen before the morning bell, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors as he searched for some task to occupy his hands and his mind. That's when he found the headmaster of the monastery sitting alone in the Zen garden, watching the sunrise. "Come, sit with me," the master said, his voice calm like the surface of a lake on a windless day. The young monk hesitated, his body instinctively seeking an excuse to escape. But the gentle authority in the master's voice left no room for evasion. "I see you flee from silence like a deer from a tiger," the master observed after several minutes of quiet that to the young monk felt eternal. "Why do you fear your own company so much?" The question struck the young monk like thunder on a clear day. His hands began to sweat, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied moments of forced solitude. "Master," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "it's not that I fear my own company. It's just, there's so much to do, so much to learn. How can I sit still when there are so many sutras to study, so many tasks to complete, so many brothers who might need help?" The master smiled, a smile that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the mountains. "Have you ever wondered why the water of a lake must be still to perfectly reflect the sky?" The young monk frowned, confused. "But master, aren't we here to serve, to help all sentient beings?" "How can you truly help anyone?" the master replied, "if you can't even be at peace with your own being? The constant noise you create around you is like throwing stones in a lake, disturbing its surface. How will you see your true nature in such turbulent waters?" At that moment, as if to emphasize the master's words, a solitary bird cut across the morning sky, its reflection gliding perfectly over the surface of the small garden lake. The young monk watched, fascinated, as the bird's image appeared clearer and more defined on the still water than in the sky itself. "Tomorrow," the master said, rising with the grace of someone who had practiced that movement thousands of times, "I have a special task for you. Now, go and meditate on why silence frightens you as much as noise frightens others." The young monk remained seated in the garden long after the master had left, his heart beating fast with both anticipation and fear of what this special task might be. For the first time in a long while, he didn't immediately run off in search of a distraction. Instead, he stayed there, observing how his restless thoughts were like clouds passing through the sky of his mind, some dark and menacing, others light and fleeting, all of them reflected on the increasingly calm surface of his consciousness. The next morning, dew still clung to the lotus leaves in the garden when the young monk was summoned to the main hall. Golden dawn light filtered through the old rice paper windows, casting dancing patterns on the polished wooden floor, worn smooth by generations of bare feet. The headmaster sat on his usual meditation cushion, so still he seemed to be part of the temple's very architecture. "Do you know of the pavilion of the solitary moon?" asked the master, his voice echoing softly through the empty hall. The young monk nodded hesitantly. Everyone at the monastery knew of the small, secluded temple at the mountain's peak. It was a place shrouded in legends, where it was said that great masters of the past had reached enlightenment within its solitary walls. Some older monks claimed that even the silence there had a different quality, as if it were denser, more alive. "Starting tomorrow," the master continued, "you will be the guardian of the pavilion of the solitary moon for 100 days. The blood seemed to freeze in the young monk's veins. 100 days. Alone, at the mountain's peak. The words fell upon him like heavy stones, each adding weight to the terror rising in his chest. "The pavilion needs basic care," the master went on, seemingly unaware of the young disciple's growing panic. "Your tasks will be to sweep the temple, tend to the altar, care for the small garden, and most importantly, sit in zazen 4 times a day, observing your own heart-mind." The master then drew from his robe a small bronze bell, so ancient its surface had acquired a greenish patina. This bell belonged to the first guardian of the pavilion 300 years ago. Its sound is known to penetrate even the thickest fog of the mind. "But, master," the young monk's voice trembled, almost a whisper, "how will I study the sutras alone? How will I develop compassion without the presence of others? Wouldn't it be more beneficial to my spiritual growth to stay here, where I can learn from my Dharma brothers?" A gentle smile crossed the master's face, like a ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Tell me, young one, when you look at a churning lake, can you see your own reflection clearly?" "No, master." "And when the lake is calm?" "The reflection is perfect, master." "Then how can you hope to see the true nature of all beings if you cannot even see your own nature?" Sometimes, the greatest act of compassion is to learn to be at peace with yourself. The young monk felt tears gathering in his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he held the ancient bell the master had given him. The cold metal against his palm seemed to amplify the reality of his situation. "Master," he tried again, his voice choked. "What if I'm not ready? What if the silence is too much?" The master rose and walked to the window, gazing at the distant mountains standing like silent guardians of the monastery. "Do you know the story of the diamond?" The young monk shook his head. "A diamond begins as ordinary coal, pressed by the darkness and solitude of the earth's depths. Through that pressure, through that seeming adversity, it transforms into the brightest of stones. Silence, my young one, will be your transformative pressure." That afternoon, as he prepared his modest belongings for the journey, the young monk felt as if he were packing for his own funeral. Each item he placed in his cloth bag felt as heavy as a boulder. His extra robe, his begging bowl, a few candles, his notebook, which now seemed woefully inadequate for 100 days of solitude. Seeing him in the kitchen one last time, Master Tenzo offered him a small packet of green tea. "For the longer nights," he said with an understanding smile. "Remember, even the most turbulent water, if left undisturbed, eventually settles." As the sun began its descent on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the young monk stood at the monastery gate, looking up at the trail winding up the mountain. The path to the pavilion of the solitary moon was clearly visible from there, disappearing into the clouds that embraced the mountain peak. A cold wind blew, making the leaves of the trees whisper like an ancient prayer. The bell in his bag chimed softly, a sound that seemed both an invitation and a warning. Tomorrow, at sunrise, he would embark on his journey into the unknown, not only the unknown of the mountain, but the even more daunting territory of his own mind. That night, lying on his futon for the last time before his departure, the young monk realized that the silence of the communal dormitory, which had once so disturbed him, now felt almost comforting compared to what awaited him. The gentle sounds of his brother's breathing, the occasional creak of the ancient wood, even the distant hoot of an owl, all these sounds would soon be replaced by a silence deeper than any he had ever known. The dawn of the first day at the pavilion of the solitary moon arrived cloaked in thick mist, as if the sky itself wished to veil the world the young monk had left behind. The small temple was humbler than he had imagined, a main wooden structure weathered by time, a simple altar, a living area that also served as a bedroom, and a small kitchen with a fire hearth. That first day, the young monk busied himself arranging his few belongings, deliberately stretching out the task as long as he could. Every item was placed and repositioned several times, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to make sense. The ancient bell he set on the altar, where its greenish bronze caught the rare rays of sunlight filtering through the windows. When finally there was nothing left to organize, he sat in the center of the main hall. The silence fell over him like an avalanche. It was different from the quiet of the main monastery. There, even in the stillest moments, there was always the distant whisper of human activity. Here, the silence had weight and substance. It was as if the air itself had become solid, pressing against his ears, his skin, his mind. The sound of his own breathing disturbed him. Each beat of his heart seemed to echo against the ancient walls. His thoughts, without the distraction of external noise, screamed in his head like birds trapped in too small a cage. At night, lying alone on his futon, the mountain sounds took on a haunting dimension. The wind in the trees turned into whispering voices. The occasional crack of a breaking branch sounded like the footsteps of invisible visitors. The young monk lit all the candles he had brought, only to find that the flickering light cast even more unsettling shadows on the walls. The following days dragged on like snails climbing a mountain. He set a strict routine for himself, not out of spiritual discipline, but from sheer desperation to fill the endless hours of solitude. He woke before sunrise, not because he needed to, but because sleep had become a reluctant visitor. He swept the temple 3 times a day, though the floor remained spotless after the first time. He relit the incense on the altar every hour until the air grew so thick with smoke that his eyes began to sting. He chanted sutras out loud, his voice echoing oddly against the empty walls, not so much to practice as to break the oppressive silence. On the 15th night, a fierce storm struck the mountain. The wind howled through the temple's crevices, making the beams groan like living creatures. Lightning turned night into day for split seconds, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The thunder shook the very ground. Curled up on his futon, the young monk realized he was facing 2 simultaneous storms, the one raging outside and the one brewing inside him. Each thunderclap seemed synchronized with a particularly tormenting thought: his inadequacy, his fear, his overwhelming loneliness. It was during a particularly intense moment of the storm that something inside him broke. The tears he had held back for 15 days finally overflowed. He cried like he had never cried before, his sobs blending with the wind's howling. He cried for his distant family, for the comfort of the monastery he had left, for the company of the other monks, and most of all, he cried for all the times he had used the world's noise to drown out the silent scream of his own soul. Amidst his tears, his eyes fell on the ancient bell on the altar. A flash of lightning illuminated its greenish surface, and for a moment, it seemed to glow with its own light. Stumbling, he rose and walked to the altar. His hands trembled as he took hold of the bell. The sound that emanated when he struck, it was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just a sound, it was as if the silence itself had found a voice. The vibration penetrated his bones, reverberated in his chest, and for a brief moment, both the external and internal storms seemed to calm. The young monk continued to ring the bell, not in the regular rhythm of temple rituals, but irregularly, organically, like the beats of a frightened heart gradually finding peace. Each ring brought a new revelation. The sound wasn't fighting the silence, it was emerging from it, dancing with it, returning to it. When the sun rose the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The young monk hadn't slept, but he felt strangely renewed. Something had shifted within him during that stormy night. The silence was still there, as present as before, but now it felt less like an enemy to be battled and more like a stern yet patient teacher. In the days that followed, he began to notice small changes within himself. His hands trembled less when he sat to meditate. The sound of his own breathing no longer disturbed him as much. The nighttime shadows, while still unsettling, began to feel more like silent companions than threats. It was during this period that he started writing in his notebook, no longer frantic notes about sutras or attempts to fill pages with words to ward off the silence, but simple observations of the changes he noticed in himself. One particular entry stood out. Silence is not empty as I once thought. It is full of everything I've tried not to hear all these years. Perhaps the noise I always sought wasn't to fill a void, but to cover a fullness that scared me. On the 31st day of his retreat, the young monk woke up with an unexpected idea. Outside the temple was a small abandoned space, covered with stones and wild grass. Perhaps, years ago, it had been a Zen garden, but time and the elements had erased any trace of intentional design. Without much thought, he began clearing the area. The work was arduous. Each stone had to be removed, each weed pulled out by the root. His hands, more accustomed to holding sutras than gardening tools, soon became covered in calluses. But there was something different about this physical work. It wasn't the frantic activity of before, when he sought any distraction from the silence. It was something deeper, more deliberate. For days, he worked in the garden from sunrise to sunset. He discovered that each stone had its own story to tell. Some were smooth and rounded, polished by centuries of rain and wind. Others were jagged and rough, like unresolved thoughts. He began to sort them not by size or shape, but by the feeling they evoked when he held them. One day, while meditating on where to place a particularly interesting stone, he realized he had spent hours in complete silence without even noticing. The silence was no longer a burden. It had become a companion in his contemplative work. He created patterns in the sand with a bamboo rake he had improvised. The movements of the rake became a form of meditation. Each line in the sand was like a thought being gently organized, each circle a cycle of understanding completing itself. The garden began to reflect not only his physical labor, but also his inner journey. In his journal, he wrote, "The stones do not struggle against their nature. The large stone does not try to be small. The rough one does not try to be smooth. Each simply is. Why then do I struggle so much against my own nature?" On a misty morning, while working in his garden, a soft sound caught his attention. There, perched precariously on the edge of one of the larger stones, was a small bird with a visibly injured wing. The young monk froze, fearing he might scare the wounded creature. The bird, a mountain sparrow, trembled slightly. Its dark eyes met the monk's, and in that moment, something shifted subtly in the young monk's heart. Here was another living being, alone and vulnerable, seeking refuge in his sanctuary of stone and silence. With slow, deliberate movements, the young monk prepared a small shelter for the bird, using his extra alms bowl and some scraps of cloth. He placed fresh water and crumbs of his own rice near the shelter. The sparrow, initially hesitant, eventually accepted the offer of help. In the days that followed, a quiet routine established itself between the two. In the mornings, the young monk would check on his small friend, change the water, and provide food. During the day, he would work in the garden while the bird watched from its makeshift shelter. At night, before retiring, he would make a final visit to his unexpected companion. The most surprising thing was the silence they shared. It was no longer the oppressive silence of those early days, nor even the contemplative silence he had begun to appreciate. It was a different kind of silence, a living silence, filled with mutual understanding. In his journal, he began to record the bird's small changes, how the injured wing gradually healed, how its movements grew more confident, how its eyes seemed brighter each day. He realized he was witnessing a healing process that went beyond the physical. One particular journal entry read, "The little sparrow teaches me more about compassion than all the sutras I have read. It asks for nothing more than what it needs, does not complain about its condition, and does not try to be other than it is. In its presence, I learned that sometimes the greatest act of kindness is simply to be present." As the days passed, the young monk noticed that his own healing was happening in parallel with the bird's. Each morning brought less anxiety, each evening less fear of solitude. The Zen garden continued to evolve, no longer solely through his physical labor, but through the silent presence of his small companion. One morning, about 2 weeks after its arrival, the sparrow tested its wings. The young monk watched, with a heart both heavy and at peace, as his friend took flight, first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. The bird circled the garden 3 times, as if in farewell, before disappearing into the mountain sky. Surprisingly, he felt no sadness at the departure. Instead, he experienced a deep sense of gratitude. In his journal he wrote, "The sparrow taught me that true compassion is not in clinging but in allowing each being to follow its own path. Just as it came when it needed healing and left when it was ready, I too must trust in my own healing process." The Zen garden, which had started as a project to occupy his restless hands, had transformed into a sacred space of transformation. Every stone, every line in the sand, every empty space now told not only his story, but also the story of the little sparrow who had shared his path of healing. That night, sitting on his meditation cushion, the young monk realized that silence had become his most patient and wise teacher. In the space between his thoughts, he found not the emptiness he had so feared, but a fullness he had never imagined possible. On the 60th day of his retreat, the young monk discovered a small pond hidden among the rocks, a short distance from the temple. It was a place he had ignored during his first few weeks, too consumed by his inner turmoil and fear to explore his surroundings. The pond was perfectly circular, as if carved into the mountain by some divine force. On that particular morning, the surface of the pond was so perfectly still that it looked like a polished mirror nestled among the rocks. The sky reflected in its waters was so clear that it was hard to tell where reality ended and the reflection began. The young monk sat by the pond, observing his own reflection for the first time in 2 months. The face staring back at him through the clear water was both familiar and strange. The features were the same, yet there was something different in the eyes, a depth that wasn't there before, a stillness that had replaced the old restlessness. As he watched, a leaf fell onto the pond's surface. creating ripples that distorted his image. In that moment, he had his first great realization. Just as the ripples in the pond distorted his reflection, his agitated mind had always distorted his perception of reality. Silence was not a void to be filled, but a mirror reflecting his true nature. With trembling hands, he wrote in his journal, "Silence is not absence, but presence. It is not an emptiness to be feared, but a mirror to be contemplated. My whole life, I have tried to fill a void that didn't exist, like someone trying to fill a pond that is already overflowing." He spent hours by the pond, observing how each small breeze created patterns on the water, how each passing cloud altered the reflection, how the light changed throughout the day, transforming the pond's surface from mirror to silver, from silver to gold, from gold to obsidian under the night sky. The next day, during his usual morning meditation, a soft breeze entered through the temple window, carrying with it a few leaves that danced in the air. The young monk opened his eyes and, instead of getting up to sweep the leaves as he would have done before, he remained seated, watching their aerial dance. The leaves swirled in intricate patterns, rising and falling, spinning and floating, each following its own invisible choreography. Some settled gently on the ground. Others continued their dance, carried by currents of air he couldn't see but could feel. Then he had his second great realization. Throughout his life, he had been like someone trying to control the wind when he should have simply observed the dance. Every attempt to fill silence with noise had been like trying to hold air in his hands. The tighter he grasped, the more it escaped. "We are like these leaves," he wrote in his journal, "dancing in the breeze of karma. I spent years resisting the dance, trying to control every movement, fearing every fall. But true freedom lies in enjoying the dance and trusting the wind that carries us." That afternoon, he sat in his Zen garden and, for the first time, felt no need to rake the sand or reposition the stones. He watched as the wind naturally created patterns in the sand, as the shadows of passing clouds transformed the appearance of the stones, as each moment brought its own ephemeral perfection. A bird, perhaps the same sparrow he had once cared for, perhaps not, landed on one of the stones and began to preen its feathers. The young monk observed how the small creature was perfectly at ease in its solitude, with no need to fill the silence with unnecessary activity. In his journal that night, he wrote, "Solitude has become solitude. Silence is no longer an emptiness to be filled, but a space where I can simply be. Like a leaf dancing in the wind, I no longer need to control the movement, only to join the dance." In the days that followed, his routine subtly changed. He still maintained his daily practices, meditation, cleaning the temple, tending the garden, but now these activities flowed naturally, like water down the mountain. Silence was no longer something to be conquered or overcome, but a gentle teacher, guiding him toward deeper understanding. At night, sitting on his meditation cushion, he watched the moon through the temple window. Its reflection in the pond formed a second circle of light, as perfect as the original. "Like the moon and its reflection," he wrote, "silence and sound are not two, but one." The fear I felt was only the distorted reflection of a truth that has always been here, waiting to be recognized. On the morning of the 65th day, he awoke before sunrise and climbed to a higher point on the mountain. As he watched the rising sun paint the sky with colors no artist could replicate, he understood that his transformation had been like this dawn, gradual, inevitable, and perfectly natural. "I am no longer one who fears silence," he wrote in his journal, "nor am I one who embraces it. I am like the pond, sometimes agitated, sometimes calm, but always capable of reflecting the sky." On the 100th night of his stay at the pavilion of the solitary moon, the young monk sat on the temple's veranda, gazing at the same moon that had witnessed his frightened arrival 3 months earlier. The mountain air was crystal clear, and the silence, the same silence that had once tormented him, now enveloped him like a familiar and comforting cloak. His Zen garden, bathed in the moon's silver light, told the story of his transformation in each carefully placed stone, in every line drawn in the sand. It was no longer just a garden. It was a map of his inner journey, with each element representing a moment of understanding, a lesson learned, a truth discovered. He took out his journal and reread the first few pages, smiling gently as he recognized the fear and anxiety in every rushed word. How distant now seemed that young monk who had arrived trembling at the temple, carrying not only his small bag of belongings, but also the weight of his fear of silence. The next morning, as he descended the mountain to return to the main monastery, each step was steady and mindful. The ancient bell, which he now carried with reverence, tinkled softly in his bag, its sound naturally blending with the morning silence. Upon arriving at the monastery, he found his master sitting in the same garden where, 100 days before, he had received the assignment that would change his life. The master only needed to look into his eyes to see the transformation. The young monk bowed deeply and said, "Thank you for teaching me that solitude is not the absence of company, but the presence of oneself." The master smiled. "And what else did the silence teach you?" "It taught me that I had spent my life trying to fill a cup that was already overflowing. Silence was not an emptiness to be filled, but a fullness to be discovered. Each moment of solitude was like a raindrop falling into a lake, not to fill it, but to become part of it." Before resuming his duties at the monastery, the young monk returned one last time to the Zen garden he had created. In the center, he placed a smooth stone where he inscribed a poem summarizing his journey. "In the silence of the mountain, I found not the absence of sound, but the presence of truth. In the emptiness of solitude, I discovered not a space to fill, but a treasure to uncover. In the stillness of the heart, I learned that to be alone is to be complete." Years later, other young and restless monks were sent to the pavilion of the solitary moon when they showed the same fear of silence. And there, in the carefully maintained Zen garden, they found not only the young monk's poem but also a path to their own transformation. This story teaches us that the fear of silence and solitude is in truth the fear of truly meeting ourselves. Like the young monk, many of us fill our lives with noise and constant activity, fearing what we might discover if we stop to listen to our own inner selves. True transformation occurs when we stop resisting silence and begin to recognize it as a teacher. In solitude, we do not find an emptiness to be filled, but a fullness to be discovered. Silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. Each stone in the Zen garden, each moment of contemplation, each encounter with our true nature is a step on the path to understanding that we have never truly been alone or incomplete. Just as a lake perfectly reflects the sky only when it is still, our true nature is revealed only when we allow the restlessness of our mind to settle. The power of being alone does not lie in learning to endure solitude, but in discovering that in the deepest silence and the most complete solitude, we do not find the emptiness we feared, but the fullness that was always there.